Uh, Good morning, everyone. My name is Jacob Liebenluft. I'm the Executive Vice President for Policy here at the Center for American Progress, and on behalf of CAP, I'd like to welcome all of you today. Each year, the U.S. Department of Education provides nearly $130 billion in taxpayer money in the form of student grants and loans to help 13 million students attend more than 6,000 colleges. Many of these students, however, will enroll in colleges where it is more likely that they drop out with debt than graduate. Students who do not finish are significantly more likely to default on their student loans, often with catastrophic long-term financial impacts. To make matters worse, the higher education system suffers from broad gaps in college attainment and disparities in student loan debt and default by race and income. These differences define a system that too often exacerbates inequity instead of serving as the engine for economic opportunity it could. The consequences for this extend well beyond the world of higher education, with profound implications for whether we are able to build an economy that produces broad-based shared prosperity. As gatekeepers for federal aid, accrediting agencies are positioned to play a key role in ensuring that colleges are providing a quality education and that America's higher education system is truly a generator of social and economic mobility. But a recent report from CAP has shown that while accrediting agencies are paying more attention to student outcomes than they get credit for, accreditors are not always using evidence of poor outcomes to hold colleges accountable the way they should be. That lack of true accountability allows accreditors to avoid addressing the worst outcomes and exacerbates a system that can fail to help institutions improve in tangible ways. That should change, and there's reason to believe it will. The ability of accreditors to effectively perform their role is increasingly under the microscope, and we see criticism from both the right and the left. An upcoming reauthorization of the Higher Education Act has the potential to lead to a bipartisan solution. And the U.S. Department of Education has announced earlier this year that it intends to conduct rulemaking on accreditation reform. But if there's growing recognition that the status quo will change, there is still the open question of what comes next. A new book, Accreditation on the Edge, takes a deep look at an array of different perspectives, from institutions of higher education, policymakers, consumer advocates, and accreditors themselves, exploring some of the critical issues that need to be addressed if accreditation is to remain relevant to the needs of higher education in the 21st century. And today's panel offers a unique opportunity to hear from some of the leaders in that discussion. So I'd like to turn it over to our moderator, David Bergeron. David is a senior fellow here at CAP, and before that served in several senior roles at the Department of Education over the years, including as the Acting Assistant Secretary for Post-Secondary Education and Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy, Planning, and Innovation for Post-Secondary Education under the Obama administration. So I'd like to say thank you to our panelists and to our audience, both in the room and following online, including with our hashtag, and we always have hashtags, hashtag on the edge. And with that, I'll turn it over to David.
Good morning. Thank you, Jacob, for that introduction. Very happy to be back at the Center for American Progress. Spent a couple of years here pretty much full time, and so it's nice to be back and moderating a panel again. This morning, I have the great pleasure to have some longtime friends and some new friends joining on the panel. I'm going to start by introducing Dr. Jose Luis Cruz, who's the president of Lehman College of the City University of New York. And before that, he served as a provost at Cal State Fullerton and is and also was the vice president for higher education policy at the Education Trust. Next to Dr. Cruz is Sylvia Manning, who's the former president of the Higher Learning Commission and Chancellor Emerita of the University of Chicago, Illinois at Chicago. She's also served as interim president of Shepherd University and has held a number of positions in higher education. Importantly for this conversation, she is also a contributor for Accreditation on the Edge. Susan Phillips is the professor of education policy and leadership, as well as counseling psychology at the University of Albany, and is a leadership fellow at SUNY's Sale Institute. Importantly for this conversation, she is the co-editor of the book Accreditation on the Edge, along with Kevin Kinsner. Someday I'll pronounce names right. Dr. Phillips also has served as a member and past chair of the National Advisory Committee on Institutional Quality and Integrity, where I had the great pleasure to interact with her there. Finally, Antoinette Flores is an associate director of post-secondary education team here at the Center for American Progress. She leads the center's work on accreditation and quality assurance, and has become a dear, dear, dear friend in the work that we've done together. Susan, I'd like to start by giving you an opportunity to give a brief overview on accreditation on the edge, and particularly how it came about.
Thanks, David. I'd love to. This actually started probably in 2014 or so. Lamar Alexander was holding hearings in the Help Committee, and there were lots of ideas coming out about how accreditation should be fixed. The Higher Education Act was just on the horizon, not so distant horizon, listening to the conversations there as I testified and heard other people's testimony and all the ideas that were coming up. It was clear that nobody was happy with accreditation. Nobody was happy. But there were a lot of different sources of discontent and different solutions. And the proposals that were coming out were ones that looked very much like what Kevin Kinzer and I called a game of Jenga, where if you just take out one piece and then somebody else takes out one piece, the whole thing falls down. What we wanted to do as we looked at this was to bring all of those voices together, to get all of the Jenga pieces, well, as many as we could, into one book, and to look at that about where accreditation should go from each of these perspectives. All of them are legitimate and interesting and good perspectives. Singly, they don't work. Together, maybe they work. And so that's what we put together. There was the book. We thank, I think, a call out to Kevin Kinzer, my co-editor, and I think I've got a couple of authors in the room, Leah Matthews and Armand Akalbe. Yes, hi. Thank you. I don't think I've got others, but for those who have contributed to the book, we ended up asking for perspectives of accreditors, of policymakers, of institutions, and of consumers. And so we're trying to bring all four of those perspectives together into one set of Jenga pieces, and we ended up coming out with some very comprehensive ideas about what needs to be thought about if you're going to fix accreditation. 5 issues. I think of them as sort of the litmus test, the filter, the test through which you need to put any kind of solution. And that's how it came to be. Is that?
Susan.
Yes.
Thank you for putting the volume together.
Yeah.
I think it's really important. Dr. Cruz, as provost, I'm sure you had some significant interactions with accreditation, and I'm sure that's continued as president of Lehman College. From your perspective, what does accreditation get right, and what does it get wrong in serving today's students?
Well, I've had the privilege of working with accreditation closely on many different levels. I think I've gone through or participated in about 35 accreditation processes in my lifetime, from regional accreditation as well as programmatic accreditation. Fullerton alone, I think we did 30 different programmatic level accreditation processes. And what I will say is that in terms of serving students, institutions serve students. Accreditors do not serve students. Accreditation agencies will help institutions drive the types of learning outcomes and student outcomes that we should all be held accountable for. And because it is a process, it's only as good as the standards that are in place and the people that are involved, the quality of execution in getting it done. And so when all of the pieces fall in line, and this is truly the case in most of my experience, it's a very fruitful process in which an institution receives valuable input that after reflecting on what it is they do day in and day out to advance their mission, that allows them to improve across the board on all the things that are important for higher ed institutions. So as one example, at Cal State Fullerton, we had received, when I got there, a accreditation report that was less than stellar. And they called out the institution for not having a strategic plan, not necessarily addressing directly academic quality, concerns around student success, particularly achievement gaps between different types of students, and the creation of an inclusive environment by securing a diverse, not only student body, but also faculty and staff. And that provided the institution, because academics are very proud, an opportunity to really have a sense of urgency and within 6 months put together a strategic plan that would drive the work over the next several years to the point where in 3 years, if we just use graduation rates as an example, the institution increased its graduation rate by 12 percentage points. And regardless of the metrics that you look at in that plan, you see that there was improvement. So accreditation served the students well by driving that work at the institution. When accreditation does not serve students well is when the process does not work, either because the accreditors or the teams that are sent to the institutions are not competently executing or discharging the responsibility, or the institutions themselves are not taking the process seriously or are perhaps even trying to game it.
I think that's a really important point, that it's a lot of what we see being effective in accreditation is the effort that the institution puts into it. I know, Sylvia, you've been on both sides of this. You played a leadership role at institutions, but also you played a critical role leading I think the largest of the regional accreditors. And so, I'd ask you whether you think that accreditors today can be spoken of as being reliable authorities on the quality of higher education.
Yeah, so reliable and authority are a little complicated as far as terms go, right? So if authority means do they know quality? Are they able to understand it? Are they able to figure it out? I think, in fact, the answer is, at any rate, they're better than any other entity that is around. They do understand the complexity of what quality really is. They do understand the limits of most of the quick indicators. We want quick indicators because they make things a hell of a lot easier. But unfortunately, they are always distorted. And that's something accreditors understand very well. Reliable, the question is to whom and for what? I think Jose's point that accreditors do not serve students directly is really very important. It's institutions that serve students. And so what accreditors do is try to ensure that the institutions are serving the students as well as they can, and certainly more than adequately. But nonetheless, given the way things have evolved and where we are today, it would be useful for accreditors to find a way to convey some of that information that they hold to the public in a way that is truly accessible. And truly accessible, in my view, does not mean it's on the website. It means that it is presented and stated in a fashion that an ordinary human being can read it and make some sense of it. And so deluging people with tables and data is not the way to go about it. Reliable, you might ask the question, does accreditation always get it right? I think accreditation is still very much challenged, if you would, at the lower end of the range of institutional quality. There is always this problem. If you see an institution that could be doing things better, like Fullerton, you tell them they do it, it's wonderful because everybody wins. If you see an institution that is really doing a lot of things very badly, and you're getting at that boundary line of should the institution be on probation, which tells the public there are some serious problems here, or should, in fact, accreditation be withdrawn. Accreditation has tremendous difficulties there. I won't take more time to elaborate it now, but if you wanted follow-up questions, we can.
And the lower boundary, I think, is a challenge for lots of quality assurance mechanisms. Accreditation, is just a symptom of that broader problem. Antoinette, as a keen observer of accreditation, do you think that it offers students and or employers, or to the general public for that matter, a guarantee of college quality?
Thanks, David. I would say we're pretty far from any kind of guarantee of quality for students. And we certainly have plenty of quality institutions in our higher education system that serve students well. But the question for me is really, are accrediting agencies meeting the purpose they were intended to fulfill? We've relied on accrediting agencies for over 60 years with one very specific purpose. It wasn't continuous improvement, it wasn't assessment of student learning, it wasn't whether a college is fulfilling its mission. It was very strictly consumer protection and protecting taxpayer dollars. David, your chapter talks a little bit about this. But the reason why is because after the first GI Bill, we saw massive fraud in the aid that was offered to students. And some of these same problems that were occurring 60 years ago are still occurring today. So are accreditors protecting students and taxpayers? I would say start with ACICS, which is an agency that was just restored by the Secretary, and which a CAP investigation found in 90 different instances named colleges or programs to its honor roll at the same time they were under investigation for fraud or for misrepresentation to students. But for me, it goes much broader than that. It's not about one agency, it's about quality for students. What promise are we delivering to students? And we know that students that enroll in college in many cases have a much higher likelihood of dropping out than they do of graduating. And students that drop out are almost 3 times as likely to default on their student loans. It's not just about the overall picture. We also have massive equity gaps among students, and that's in things like completion, that's in things like student loan default. So for example, CAP recently released some work that looked at who defaults on their student loans. And we know that these students are significantly more likely to be low income, significantly more likely to be students of color. So for example, among students that defaulted, about 90% of them at one point received a Pell Grant. That means they're already low income. We have serious quality problems and problems in the promise that we deliver to students that has an impact on real people's lives. Accreditation is not just this abstract idea, it impacts students' lives. And as long as accrediting agencies are not paying attention to this, and I'm not saying that all are, because you've heard from President Cruz that some accrediting agencies are paying attention to equity. But as long as this is broadly ignored, for those students who end up worse off, there is no guarantee of quality.
So if there's no guarantee of quality, aren't we left with the very real problem that the book is attempting to address, which is that to some extent accreditation is at a tipping point, and we're kind of at a place where either we can have really serious, robust reforms within accreditation, or we're going to have to find some alternative quality assurance mechanism to ensure that particularly the most vulnerable students are protected. Often the most vulnerable students are attending the institutions that you talked about that are at the lower bound of the quality spectrum, and isn't that a disservice? So, and this is kind of a question for the panel. Do we think we're really at this tripping point, or can we reform where we have to go somewhere else, or are we really at a place where we will see real reform among the accreditors? Maybe some of you can start with that, because I know you've thought about it probably as much as anyone in the country.
It's funny, when Susan invited me to do a chapter, she said, you should write about what's good about accreditation and how it works well. And at first I thought, well, I can't quite do that. And so I bargained with her and I said, can I have a little section where I have some demurs where I can say it's not perfect. It was much later, when I was much too far in it to pull out, that I realized that it was actually much worse than that. I was being set up here. And when I look at the book, I think it looks a little bit like that. But go directly to your question. I think the answer is reform, but it's not only within accreditation. I'll give you an example. There was mention in a number of the essays of the problem that the consequence of losing accreditation, it's red or green.
Right.
You're in or you're out. There's nothing graded. Jamie and Studley, who, by the way, for me, wins the prize for the most interesting and compelling essay in the book, talks at the end, admonishes accreditors to stop worrying about the students who are going to get hurt when the institution loses its accreditation. And you look at it, and I understand what she's saying, but that's sort of an unnatural act for most of the people who are involved in accreditation. And you can't really say, pay more attention to students, but don't worry about them when they're left holding the bag because their institution has lost accreditation. So one of the things that we need, which accreditation cannot do on its own, it needs authorization to do that, is to have different levels of punishment, so to say. So one quick example would be if an institution could be told that they cannot admit any additional students with access to Title IV funds, but all the current students can continue. And then you might work with a plan for students to be able to transfer out and complete their degrees. But we need more graduated levels of sanction on institutions. And there's more detail, too. There could be this institution that is on probation, more might be required of it than hanging its head and fixing its problems. So sometimes accreditation can work on its own, but a lot of the time it needs to be able to work with other entities under the current structure with the Department of Education to, for one thing, work on developing better outcome measures for student learning, because we really don't have it. All the measures that people here are talking about are proxies. They actually don't tell you whether a student learned anything. And that's part of our problem. And the existing measures are not measures that people who are deeply involved in the teaching and learning process think are particularly valid. So there's a lot of work to be done there.
I think that there's a lot in what you just said, and I just want to pull at one point and let Dr. Cruz respond to it, and that is, would it have been helpful to you in your experiences at Fullerton, particularly, to have had some kind of a tiered description of where you were in terms of quality to motivate some of the work that you ultimately had to lead around?
Frankly, no, because I think we're not, and this is the case for most public state colleges and universities, we're not in that bottom area where accreditation has the most difficulty in trying to help not only maintain the credibility as a seal of quality, but also help the institution do better. The fact of the matter is that public institutions are not only susceptible to accreditation at the regional and the programmatic level, but of course we have board of trustees that are appointed by elected officials. We have advocacy organizations and communities that we're responsible for our outcomes. And so there are many layers and many other players that provide guidance as to where it is that we feel as investors in this enterprise that you should be. But what I will say is, because it's really important in the broader conversation, it's that it's very hard for accrediting bodies to make sort of these judgments on where the thresholds are when we're getting so many mixed signals from our elected officials in the first place. So you look at the Prosper Act, and somehow in the proposal that's being put forth for how work-study dollars will be allocated, the biggest loser is the City University of New York, which is one of the largest institutions in the country, serving the most diverse student body. And the biggest winner, among the biggest winners, is the University of Ashford, which is the poster child of bad behavior in the for-profit sector. So if we can bash on accrediting agencies all we want, but until we get a better sense of what it is that we expect them to do, and not only them, but the federal and the state level pieces of the triad, then we're really not going to get very far.
Yeah, I was not implying that Cal State Fullerton was at that.
I understand.
I just was thinking that often I hear leaders in institutions say, it would be great if there was a gold star category that we could aspire to, so that we, maybe, above the middle of the pack, but maybe if we could find a way to motivate to move people into the top tier. And that was more what I was trying to suggest. But and Susan, I know you certainly have some thoughts around this, having thought about this again a very long time, about where we are. Are we on the cusp of a real revolution in the way that we think about accreditation and quality assurance, or are we going to fall back on the things about accreditation that I think keep us very carefully tied to the 19th century?
I think we're going to do both. So the answer is yes. One of the critical points here is who says what quality is. And so somebody says it this way, and somebody says it that way, and somebody else says it this way. And what puts accreditation on the edge at this point is that so much in higher education has evolved, has changed, has merged, has come from a different angle. And so much of the stakeholders have emerged as, it's not just the student, it's also society, it's also the federal government, it's also the accreditor, it's also the employer, it's also the consumer as in protection. There are so many more voices at the table saying, we need higher education to do this for us. We need higher education to do that for us. Accreditation, would you please make that happen? And that set of expectations on accreditation and on higher education more broadly is what puts us on the edge. That's not going to roll back. The stakeholders aren't going to recede. The requests for my definition of quality are going to continue in advance. And that's what I think will take us forward. Now, that said, there are consequences of going off the high board that the country maybe isn't ready to take, or institutions aren't ready to take, or policymakers aren't ready to take. And so those kinds of, will it be completely over the edge? Well, we said in the book it would be a fool's errand to predict these things right now, yes, given the climate. But it is very hard to predict because there are so many interests and so many stakeholders and so many definitions of where it ought to go. Will we go off the high board? No, but we'll definitely not go just off the low board. It's going to be somewhere in between, I would venture to guess.
I think that's a pretty good guess at where this will come out. Although I do think that we have a streak that allows us to keep moving back to wanting the world to be the way it used to be. And I think one of the areas where I think that's most evident is that around this issue of, student outcomes, outcomes for students. This question comes up again and again in the book. I addressed it significantly in my chapter, where I tried to put forward an expansive view of what outcomes really look like. For me, thinking about higher education affordability and diversity of our outcomes, just like retention and graduation and economic returns are. With that in mind, are student outcomes a reliable measure of quality, and should accreditors be looking at that more? And I'd turn that over to Antoinette to start us off in responding to that, because I know she's been thinking about that a good deal.
I would say absolutely yes. The number one reason why students go to college in the first place is to get a job and lead a more stable and secure life. That's the number one priority for students. That's not the number one priority for accreditors. So we recently released a report that looked at to what extent accrediting agencies are looking at student outcomes and using student outcomes in their reviews. If you listen to some of the criticism on this, it makes it sound like accreditors aren't looking at this at all. That's certainly not the case, and I think they're doing a lot more than is acknowledged. So for example, every agency is collecting student outcomes data on an annual basis. For national agencies, that means having strong benchmarks and collecting data down to the individual program level. It changes when you look at how this information is being used in reviews. So for example, one college in its accrediting review, it's regionally accredited. Mind you, there are no clear benchmarks or requirements on, from regional accreditors. The institution's graduation rate hovers around 15%, and it acknowledges this is unacceptable. It had done a number of things to try and improve its performance, and it had plans to do to make more changes. But over the previous 10 years had made very little inroad into how well it was serving students. The way the accrediting report looks at this is to say, great, it commended the college for its focus on student success, its focus on improvement, but it never said whether this level of performance is adequate. And so in other words, the very intent to improve is good enough. I could give further examples, but as part of that, I think we see this across the board, where colleges are not performing in a way that we would expect, are not serving a majority of their students well, and the accreditors focused on improvement. I think we need clear benchmarks, and I think we need clear action from accrediting agencies.
Thank you. One of the things that we often hear people complain about and about accreditation is that accreditors stand in the way of innovation. And do you think that's a fair assessment for the role that accreditors play, or do you think that accreditors are good at putting guardrails to keep institutions in check from engaging in innovation that's potentially harmful to students?
I think you can probably guess what my answer is. It's a very difficult space, but accreditors are conservative in that way, and I think that is really important. On the other hand, accreditors have been much less conservative than, for example, your past entity, the Department of Education, which to this day, for example, maintains a posture towards distance education that is extremely difficult, like the distinction between correspondence education and distance education, which very few people understand, and once you try to apply it, becomes really difficult. And so there are lots of things that stand in the way of innovation. It is also true that when an individual or an institution is held in check by the accreditor, one immediate way to deal with this, especially from a PR perspective, is to wrap yourself in the blanket of innovation and scream martyrdom. So there is really a challenge there. I do think the system right now is impossible for new institutions that want to come out in a new way, although it's also impossible for new institutions that want to be very traditional, conventional, because basically it's a chicken or the egg problem. Yeah. You can't get in students until you have access to federal financial aid, and you can't get access to federal financial aid until you have students, and you have had them for some time, and accreditation is required to accredit not on the basis of a plan or hope or a good intention, but on the basis of accomplishment. So the institution has to show that it can properly serve students before it can be accredited. And so there, actually, I think we need a whole different pathway to federal funds for new institutions for the first 10 years or something like that, 5-10 years of the institution's existence.
It's an interesting point, because to some extent that begs the question about the triad more broadly, because the triad assumes that the states approve an institution first. So you think about creditors stepping in only after an institution is operate with that state approval for a while. But you're quite correct. You need financial aid to make that system work.
And David, except for those states that won't approve until the institution is accredited.
Yeah, some places the chicken and egg problem even gets worse. But I'm struck by the fact that you talked about the issue of regular and substantive interaction between faculty and students, and where I have actually written for a journal on competence-based education, where I took issue with my former colleagues at the Department of Education on that particular point, because I think it is critical for us to think about how we change our institution, our accreditation system to be more supportive of institutions, and clearly this is an interest both in the Congress in terms of reauthorization, and also of the Trump administration, where they're talking about deregulating accreditation. So I was wondering, if you think about either of those areas, what would your advice be, either to the Trump administration or to the Congress with regard to accreditation? Maybe we'll start with Susan.
Well, I would add my wish list that any proposed change be run through several tests. One is going to make it more messy, which has been the track record so far. Two is, how does it think about the notion of quality, and who defines it and who measures it? One is how it thinks about innovation. Does it enhance it? Does it get in the way? Does it give guardrails? One is how it deals with information. Does it ask for more information that is not of particular use? All of those are issues that I would put as, filter your ideas through these 5 different dimensions to be able to determine what the unintended outcomes may be of that. So my wish list is that it be a thoughtful change that considers the things that we may not expect to come out of this. That's my wish list.
Well, unfortunately, it's a little difficult because it's part of a bigger question. That is, should we reform through negotiated rulemaking? Should we reform through sub-regulatory guidance? Or should we wait for Congress? And sometimes that can be a long wait, but that's the way the system was set up to operate. And I tend generally towards the wait for Congress.
It could be a long wait. Last time there were about a decade and about 17 short-term interim extensions, all of which have the risk of reforms being made kind of piecemeal.
Right, that's a problem, but I think the negotiated rulemaking is a very flawed process at the moment, so maybe there's a way to do this, but through a better process.
Well, and there's much that's in the statute.
Yes.
That isn't going to be changed by rulemaking.
Right. And for me, I think that's the compelling piece, is that so much of what's in there around accreditation is statutory. Dr. Cruz, do you have a wish?
A wish. I think that if we have to wait, then I would hope that there would be a sense of urgency around dealing with the cases that are in that borderline. And so we need a differentiated approach to the way that we're trying to certify access to Title IV. And in this case, I'm specifically talking about for-profit sector. If we can wait a little longer, then I would hope that there would be some effort to try to rationalize the messiness. And as an engineer, it's divide and conquer. You differentiated approaches to the sectors as needed, and some coordination, because clearly this three-legged stool is very unbalanced on what the federal and the state are willing or able to do and what they're requiring of the accreditation agencies.
I would also say wait for Congress. Based on what we've seen this administration do so far on gainful employment and borrow defense, I am very wary of any attempt to deregulate accreditation. Those instances have looked a lot more like protecting poor performing institutions at the expense of students. And accreditation is different because it serves all students and all institutions. And so I would be wary about attempts to roll back regulations. Part of my other concern here is that we shouldn't be rolling back regulations for regulation's sake. And, you know, I get that burden is an issue, but it's based on the assumption that all burden is inherently bad. On the contrary, colleges and accrediting agencies should be agreeing to play by basic rules to access the aid system.
Antoinette,
Nice.
we're going to turn to the audience for questions, but I think I heard over my shoulder here somebody wanting to say something.
I just wanted to amend what I said a little bit, which is if we could have some negotiated rule unmaking as opposed to rule making, and we could get rid of the credit hour, I'll pay for that.
With that, we'll turn to the audience, and if anybody wants to know my wish list, they can ask me. Any questions from the audience? Then we have somebody over here with a microphone.
Sure. My name is Sally Johnstone, and I'm with NCHEM's National Center for Higher Education Management Systems, as well as a number of other things. And David, I would like to hear your wish list, but I also wanted to pose something, I think, to the dilemma that Sylvia mentioned, which we work with a lot of states, and fortunately or unfortunately, not every state even has a system to recognize new and innovative colleges and universities. Some do, some don't. And I'm not sure there's a pathway through that dilemma, and I'd really love to hear your thoughts on that.
Basically, I think what is needed is to establish a pathway which is going to be, by the way, heavily input driven. Because when an institution is new and it doesn't have any students, there are no outputs to look at. So a very rigorous, very heavily input-driven, all the risk management that you can imagine, annual reporting, but something that allows these new institutions to access Title IV funds for students before they are accredited. And outside a lot of the expectations of accreditation. And I've actually published on this about 4 years ago electronically, but the essay didn't, it sort of landed in a big pile of silence. But at that point, and I'm still there, I couldn't decide whether I had any recommendation as to where this authority should lie. It could be in a, and there are problems with everything you think of, obviously, but it could be existing entities that might not be accreditors that would do this. It might be accreditors, existing accreditors. It might be some entity that is created for this purpose. However you do it, you would shelter this institution, and then there would be a certain time at the end of which the institution would have to become accredited.
Very much having an experiment and being able to evaluate whether or not it works.
Yeah.
That's what we ask of institutions.
Yeah, and the institution would clearly not be accredited. It would be authorized, or it would be eligible or whatever for federal funding. And students who attended that institution would have to be informed as to what that meant. And that's part of our big problem, is that students haven't a clue what this means.
Yeah, and I think that's true, but I think we have to go a step further, and then that is indemnify the students in some manner, in the sense that if they're taking on debt or investing part of their eligibility for things like Pell Grants, you know, if the experiment fails, we should make them whole. I think that's one of the things, the critical problems we've been having in higher education is we experiment in our systems without recognizing we're doing it, and then when the students are adversely impacted by it, we don't go back and fix the problem, and it's the thing that's been bothering me probably more about higher education in the way that we finance it today than anything else. I saw her hand over here, and I haven't forgotten Sally.
Hi, I'm Zoe Serpel. I'm an Education Policy Fellow with the House Committee on Education and the Workforce. So David, I have a question in the context of thinking about a system that's working or not working. You talked a little bit about having sort of a gold star process. So I'm interested in what that might look like and whether, given that the system seems to be having the most difficulties at the lower end of the spectrum, what the utility and what the goal of that would be, and whether it wouldn't lead to a system where you have sort of two different accreditation processes. So wondering if you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah, I've been moderating, so I've been very careful to keep my personal opinions out of this to this point. So I appreciate the question. So when I wrote my chapter and I reflected back on something I had written here when I was at the Center as a vice president, I made the point in that chapter that we really need a system that rewards institutions for doing all the things we want them to do well. And for me, that starts with things like affordability, diversity, and then goes to things like retention, graduation, economic outcomes, or progression into graduate school, if that's what the institution's goal is. And so an institution that does all of those things really well, I would say we should label that and say, here's what we want institutions to look like. We want them to be diverse. We want them to be affordable to the lowest income students in our society. And they then serve them extraordinarily well. And I would like to be able to recognize those institutions because they provide a guide to what other institutions could be doing in terms of the improvements they can make. And there are lots of education leaders who are looking for those guides because they all learn, collectively how to advance that cause. And at the bottom end of that spectrum, I make a differentiation between institutions that are really trying hard to be affordable and serve a diverse student body, a student body that often is left out of higher education, but then they let those students down. And those institutions, in my estimate, need more help, whether it's additional financial resources or help from successful institutions. And so within that group, I think that there are a vast array of institutions that just need more help to be successful. And then there are institutions that don't care about affordability, don't care about diversity, and then still don't serve students well. And those are that tier that, for me, just need to be out of the system. They just need to be gone. They're not, in my mind, meeting the definition of what an institution of higher education is. Antoinette raised a question last week in one of her tweets about, if an institution graduates no students on time, is it an institution of higher education? And my answer to that question is no. If it graduates one, is it an institution of higher education? My answer to that question is no. For me, there's some thresholds there, and I think we need to recognize that. So both ends, I think it's helpful to have some kind of graded system. I don't know that accreditors can do it. Sylvia makes an argument that I could be persuaded of that maybe they can, but I think we really need to have a really serious conversation about what does quality look like, and what is it that we're measuring. Next question. Yes, sir.
Philip Lapel from the MIT Washington office. Two very quick questions. One is that in your talk about innovation, you focused on new institutions. And a lot of existing institutions are attempting to do very innovative things. I think what I understand is there's a lot of variation in the extent to which different accreditors are supportive of that. We're pretty lucky. So I wonder what you have to say about that. And the second one is that the response to the question from David about are outcomes a useful measure for the accreditors to use was a very clear yes. But institutionally, we think that the outcome measures are not very reliable. So how can it be a useful thing for accreditors if it's not a reliable statistic to start? And what do we need to do to fix that?
Let me take on the outcome question. I created a list of possible outcomes that might include access, diversity, course passed, degree completed, job held, loans repaid, life well lived, and world peace, if you were to ask Johnson. That's a fairly broad set of concepts that is supposed to be achieved by this higher education and assured by the accreditation process. Which ones have meaning for your particular institution or your kind of institution, or the program within your institution? Thinking about some of the specialized accreditors, the specialized and programmatic accreditors, they often have very specific outcome expectations. X% needs to pass at this level on this test. Other accreditors have much broader expectations, and they're defined more by the institution, which is a rule of construction that lives in the statute, not in the accreditation process. So are outcomes reliable? Give me an outcome. Right, graduation rate is another one.
Which is easily fixed by a student level data system, which Congress specifically prohibited the department from having. So there are ways we can address some of these data deficiencies that make these outcome measures particularly problematic.
But there's another problem, which is not just that the data is deficient, but that it's measuring the wrong thing. There's really a large question here of validity, and I think that may be what the gentleman here is raising. My sense is that what you have to do is you have to get institutions to look at these numbers, to look at them consciously or honestly, figure out what it means, why they're getting these numbers, and then figuring out whether in fact it's worth trying to change the number. Use them as an indicator and act on it sort of self-consciously and analytically. And that's why I think what you see accreditors doing is demanding that institutions pay attention to persistence in graduation, but not necessarily that they achieve some arbitrarily selected number after which everything is fine.
We hear this from both institutions and accreditors across the board that the outcome measures we have are inadequate. There is an easy fix. And that goes for accrediting agencies as well. So the regional accreditors just did a project where they looked at any four-year college that had a graduation rate below 25% and any community college that has a graduation rate below 15%, proving that regional accrediting agencies can come up with these kinds of benchmarks. But the response seemed to be, once the study was released, that the data is inadequate. Well, accrediting agencies can choose any measure they want. They can define their own measure. So, for example, WASC has done exactly this. They've spent years working with researchers, developing their own measure, deciding how to tailor that differently to different institutions. It can be done, and this is a solvable problem. And as long as we focus on is the measure the right measure, we're not going to get anywhere. The question should be, are institutions improving how well they serve students, whatever the measure?
If I could just quickly on that point, I think that it is not a measure, it's an indicator. And if we take it as an indicator that will allow us to dig deeper and see, okay, if you're under 25%, we got to look at you and contextualize it for me, I think that's fine. In the case of Lehman College, if you just look at our graduation rate, you will get a very different idea of the institution, in part because only 20% of our students start out as freshmen, 8% are transfers. If you look, for example, at Chetty's data from Stanford on social mobility, we're number 4 in the country, and we're number 1 among Hispanic serving institutions. So there has to be a dialogue, and it's an indicator, not a measure.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. If there is one more question.
Hi, Julie Johnson, currently a higher ed consultant. Susan, in your initial remarks, you talked about 5 issues that the book covers that address the litmus test, and I was wondering if you could just briefly elaborate on that.
Sure, let me deal with the 5. One is messiness. Much of the reform that has happened to date has been caused by well-intentioned actions trying to fix this problem or that, and it's ended up with a bigger and more complicated system. So are you making the problem worse is the first one. The second one is about what counts as quality. And I've said a fair amount about that. I don't need to say more. The third is many missions and many masters. This one is who is to be served? Is it students? Is it employers? Is it the federal dollar? Is it the taxpayer? Is it the state? So many different stakeholders, if you could say that. The fourth is information. There is a much more there's much more information available, desired, wished for, and if it were to be useful, is certainly an area that is ripe for potential modification. And the last one is innovation. Does whatever this is get in the way of innovation or promote it? On that last point, and actually speaking to the last gentleman's question, accreditors themselves are supposed to be about innovation. They're about improvement originally, figuring out what's wrong and figuring out how to do it better. I can't think of a better definition of innovation than that, of doing something different and better. How that then gets played out in a sandbox or across different accreditors or with new institutions that are not at the table yet is an issue that needs to be addressed. So those are the 5.
And just
Thank you.
briefly responding to Susan and to answering Sally's question, I'd delete the word regional everywhere it appears in the description of accreditors and allow institutions to pick whatever accreditor they want to work with to advance their goals, and because I think that would promote innovation among the accreditors. It would address a lot of the things we've talked about. And so if I could only do one thing, I'll delete that word. It's been a dangerous word and doesn't reflect the reality, which is that our nation is in a particularly critical place because we are part of a global economy where knowledge is the key to our success. And living within a construct of regional accreditors just doesn't seem to fit within that reality, at least for me. I want to thank my friends here on the panel and thank you all for coming out this morning.
Thank you.